Hello, everyone. This is episode 17 of our famous quotes about Paul. This is a episode that has been focused on so far on Robert Eisenman. There's been parts 1 and 2. I'll provide links to those in the description to this part 3, so you can catch up if you want to go back and learn more about what has gone before. This is going to be a continuation, however, of the same review we were doing earlier of the book James the Just and Habakkuk Pesher, which is a recent book by Eisenman from 2018. Anyway, in this part 3, we will continue examining that, but first I want to introduce you to a couple of points. First is this issue. Are Eisenman's DSS discoveries, Dead Sea Scrolls discoveries about the spouter of lies in the Habakkuk Pesher, the word Pesher in Hebrew means commentary, and the Habakkuk Pesher at the Dead Sea Scrolls, are these the findings which are the most key religious discoveries of all time? That's a big statement. That means something about Christianity was suppressed, destroyed, and eliminated, but was preserved by God at the Dead Sea in the Dead Sea Scrolls when they were secreted out from the Temple of Jerusalem just before its fall in 70 AD. So that's what the scholars have now surmised. What Professor Golb seemed like he was alone in advancing back in the late 80s turned out to be true and verified by the Israeli authorities and the universities. Anyway, I believe you're going to, if you've seen parts 1 and 2, you would say, sure, if Christians all knew about this work, this would fundamentally change who you think you should be allegiant to. You would learn you need to be allegiant to Jesus and realize the early church did have a certain opinion about Paul, which we're going to continue to expose in this episode today, as he does a commentary on the Habakkuk Pesher of the Dead Sea Scrolls from the 50 AD period, according to scholars we showed you last time, and the first episode and the second episode. The paleontologically, it does date to 50 AD, just as does the Damascus document, which is also found in the Dead Sea, but actually was found also in the 1890s and was already determined to be a Christian document way back then. So this is not anything unusual. It's just you're not aware that the Dead Sea Scrolls included Christian documents, because that's the whole point of why it was captured by Roman Catholic authorities for the first 40 plus years. But thanks to Robert Eisenman, these works, the scrolls, were released by the charity that was holding the plates of the scrolls that they had taken and protected, and he was given permission to make further duplicates, and that's how the Dead Sea Scrolls became publicly available to all scholars through the work of this man. So he is a great hero to truth. Now, this latest book I'm profiling here first, so these are the quotes in episodes 1 and 2 are primarily from this book. And it's called James the Just and the Habakkuk Pesher. I recommend everyone purchase this. I get nothing to tell you this except it's truth. And you can spread this truth to Christians and say, hey, look at this. Okay, so what other virtues are about this book is that it's only 154 pages. Now, in the past, when people ask me, how do you prove the Dead Sea Scrolls are about the Ebion, the early church name is the Ebion, the poor, and how are you going to prove the spouter of lies is Paul, which is what this scholar Robert Eisenman has been saying since the 90s in four major books, by the way. And yet the scholarship is totally ignored. The Protestants, Catholics want to ignore it. Why? Because they were suppressing the Bible. The Catholics were suppressing the Bible, Dead Sea Scrolls, for 40 years to prevent you from knowing about this. So why would they broadcast, hey, we were defrauding you for 40 years, that you couldn't know the truth because you're not adult enough to know the truth, that your early church doesn't agree with us, the Roman Catholic Church. And the Protestants, likewise, they went even further, more extreme towards Paul, and they don't follow the early church. And so this is a huge embarrassment both to Protestantism and Catholicism, and actually should shake the church to its very foundations to get back to Christ. So that's why this book is so fundamental, is that these prior books he did, God bless him. Please, God bless this man, because there were 1,000 pages each. A New Testament code, over 1,000 pages. James the Just, the first book he did in the late 90s, 1,000 pages. Every other book, 1,000 pages. He's very scholarly, very academic, has to give you every proof possible and every citation imaginable. but ultimately it's hard for me to share with you. And then I saw this book just a few days ago, and I'm like, wow, finally he did it. He just summarizes it in clear English, but he doesn't avoid giving you the citations to what DSS scroll, Dead Sea Scrolls manuscript, or they have a numbering system. So he gives you all these things that if you're a true scholar, you can go look up these things and see them online. And by the way, they're at dssenglish.com. If you want to see they have them organized by the name of the digitized Dead Sea Scroll micrographs, microfilm, and then you can switch and you can see it by passage itself. So great site to go look at when you want to read up on the Dead Sea Scrolls. Anyway, so let's continue here. So for $2.99, you can put this in your Kindle today. I did it. I went through all my devices. Paperback, you want to send it to someone, and it does have some academic level to it, but it's still, and we know he's not a Christian. Okay, we're not saying he's a Christian, but he's a scholar who's neutral. He doesn't care. He just thinks Christians should know about the foundation of their church and how this split goes. Anyway, so let's continue. I'm going to give you now background on Eisenman real quickly so we can get to these new quotes from for this episode. He is Professor Emeritus of Middle East Religions and Archaeology and Islamic Law and the Director of the Institute for the Study of Judeo-Christian Origins at California State University, Long Beach. He has a PhD in Middle East Languages and Culture with a specialty in Islamic Law from Columbia University. He holds a Master of Arts degree from New York University in Hebrew and Near East Studies. So this guy knows every language of that era in this time period, so he can make assessments that are basically almost unique, meaning without him, how would we have ever known half of this stuff? That's what I think it's just an amazing blessing of God. Now, Eisenman is famous for many, many books, but his theory on the Habakkuk Pesher began in his I shouldn't say his first work, but his first major taking of all the breakthroughs that the plates gave him. He pointed he saw right away. It's the Ebion. It's the early church of Christianity, the Zadik, James the Just. He spotted it right away. It's like it jumps off the page at you, but it's only gotten stronger and stronger since then. But his first work from 1997, as I recollect, is James, the brother of Jesus. And that's the work that I read for my 2005 work, Jesus Words Only. And that's where chapter 12 summarizes and quotes his book extensively. But again, many of you don't want to read through 1,000 pages or have such a big book in your library. Well, now you have a real convenient option, which is just to buy the Kindle for $2.99. I recommend you do that and just skim it and see if it doesn't intrigue you. But I'm trying to give you highlights that will encourage you to buy it and maybe share the print version with people who you want to send this material to ask their opinion and see what they think. All right, so this brings us to the slide we ended with last time, where we were going to deal with this in this part. So here we will begin. Now he's talking about, he's again summarizing the Habakkuk Pesher and making commentary. That is, Eisenman is doing that. Like the eschatological sense of the Zadokite exegesis, he's talking about the Ezekiel view that the righteous who sins is lost, and then the lost person who repents from sin is saved. That's Zadokite eschatology of the end of days, to have salvation on Judgment Day. The eschatological sense of the Habakkuk 2, verse 4 Peshers, quote, saved from the Beit HaMishpat, which means the final supreme judgment. We talked about that in another episode 1, I think it was, has escaped many commentators. So what he's saying is the fact that the Habakkuk Pesher, the commentary at the Dead Sea Scrolls, is addressing an issue about how to get saved versus not saved, it can be extracted from the meaning of Habakkuk 2, verse 4. And it's talking about, in Hebrew, it's talking about you are saved from the final judgment by means of what? By means of amanah, which means faithfulness or obedience. So now, if you read Habakkuk 2, verse 4, it doesn't say from final judgment. Why Heiserman is saying the fact that it is talking in the same sense that Paul talks about it with the opposite conclusion is what he's saying is overlooked by many scholars. So it's not a little thing that a text that doesn't say when it says in Habakkuk 2:4, the just shall live by his emanah, his obedience, his faithfulness. It doesn't say that you're saved But this passage in Habakkuk Pesher is saying that's the issue. And that's the issue that was made by the spouter of lies, that you could be saved, but reading it in Greek, reading it in a different meaning, came out saying the just shall live by faith. And this Habakkuk Pesher, the Zadik, is writing against this and saying that's false. Hence, with that in mind, listen to this again. I'm going to start from this point. The eschatological sense, that end times sense of the Habakkuk 2 verse 4's Pesher, that's the Dead Sea Scroll, when it says, quote, saved from the Beit HaMishpat, the final supreme judgment, has escaped many commentators. He's pointing right at the fact that they're not linking it up with the church, the earliest church, having a conflict with somebody who teaches the opposite of what this commentary says. So the Evian are up against a person whom we know independently from Eusebius and Irenaeus had concluded that Paul was an apostate from God's law. This is not to be unexpected. If this is the Ebion writings here, they're now going to show why Paul is an apostate, where he teaches contrary to God's law and prophets. Here we're dealing with the prophet Habakkuk. Okay. Then it says, in addition, the Pesher, the Dead Sea Scrolls commentary on Habakkuk, retains James' all-important soteriological stress on works. Soteriological means salvific, meaning how you are saved is not by faith alone, but by adding additional works that are mandatory, not excusable, and not irrelevant, as Paul teaches, along with faith. So he doesn't say you shouldn't have faith and just have works. He's saying you have to have works and faith. Let's continue. And this is at page 9. In applying the general theory outlined in Maccabees of the special case of the Habakkuk Pesher, we are able to interpret or translate in a meaningful manner almost every passage and turn of phrase in the context of known facts about James' lives and doctrines associated with him. Stop there. So what is he saying? He's written a book. Eisenman wrote a book called Maccabees and has a long series of other names. And this is a more recent work. I think it's 2012. And in this work is where I haven't read it, but it was summarized in the introduction to this current work. This is where he proved all the paleontology and all the proofs that would show the Habakkuk Pesher is from 50 A.D. And then he then goes into explaining how, using that work, that general outline, he then was able to attach all these connections between the Habakkuk Pesher and the early teachings of James. Okay, so Eisenman then writes, quote, this ability to explain the key allusions at Qumran, meaning explaining them by virtue of the James versus Paul issue, constitutes the kind of persuasive evidence the verification of the whole requires. So this is how you do critical analysis of text and where it fits in history and does it relate to any other history we know of. And this has an overwhelming persuasive proof that he is presenting. Let's go on. Next, he'll mention further, Epiphanius insists that he, that is James the Just, wore the mitre of the high priest. This is important. And all agree that he wore the priestly linen, a right accorded the lower priesthood in the period in which James held sway in Jerusalem. So we don't realize this, but Josephus mentions James the Just as a major figure of history. And Jesus gets a paragraph or a couple lines in there, and some people dispute that, but the statements he makes about James the Just are extensive and lengthy, and this was a figure well known in Jewish history, James the Just, the brother of Jesus. And one of the things is the Jewish people did not like the Herodian appointees to be who were the high priests. The high priests were not appointed by the Jewish people. It was appointed by the monarchical group called the Herodians, who the Romans had designated to be the rulers of that area on their behalf. And so when it came to the Day of Atonement, Epiphanius tells the story of how the Jewish people looked to James to do the officiating because they didn't like the high priest that they had, and they trusted James because of his Davidic lineage, incidentally. Then, let's continue to the next paragraph. One should be chary, meaning concerned, of dismissing vivid details such as these without carefully considering them. So some people say, how could he be the high priest? How could the Jewish people allow that? Well, read the details. For instance, the pseudo-Clementines or the Clementines are particularly forthcoming in telling us that James broke either one or both of his legs in a riot that erupted at the Temple Mount at the instigation of an enemy clearly intended to represent Paul. Now, remember, Rufinus edits the Clementine homilies. That's why they're called the pseudo-Clementines. But all that really means is there is an underlying text that is true, and you have to try to figure out what is the true versus what did Rufinus do to correct it or edit it or eliminate things. And what he did, because he's the Roman Catholic Church editor from the 380s, and this is no longer palatable to accept an early Christianity that was opposed to Paul, he changed the name Paul to Simon Magus every time it appears. And there's 8 references. The scholars all agree that we can see in hindsight this could only be about Paul and not about somebody named Simon Magus. Let's continue. So then it says, clearly intended to represent Paul. So this is the Clementine Homilies, a work of the Ebionites. Nobody disputes that. It was at least in existence by the 200s. Rufinus rewrites it in the 380s. He corrupts the word Paul into Simon Magus. He does a few other changes appearing to make the Ebionites look somewhat foolish. And that's totally consistent with Roman Catholic doctrine at that time. You have to remember, please go look at the Council of Laodicea from 363. It was made a crime to teach people to observe Sabbath. A crime. And you're cursed. You were cursed and anathematized if you taught anyone to keep Sabbath any longer. You have to observe the day of the sun, which is Constantine's order of 321 AD to his entire empire. You must rest and worship on the venerable day of the sun, this meaning God the Son. And he was a sun worshiper to the day he died, and we've proven that. His final instructions that Eusebius found or was instructed to follow and his military men were putting in place made no doubt he was still a sun worshiper on the day he died. It was all a fraud by Constantine on Eusebius, and Eusebius actually says that. If you read the very last thing he said, you sometimes have to read the last thing someone says and not look at a lifetime of sycophancy, which is definitely Eusebius reads like a sycophant until this last thing he says. I was shocked and dismayed at what I found he was really all about. That's what he says at the very, very, very end. But that's ignored, of course, because that doesn't fit the narrative that Constantine is a Christian. But we have a whole series on Constantine and the Constantine coin and his instructions that he should be buried in the place of Christ's position in the 12 Apostles' Church at Constantinople. We have all of that. Please look for that. But let's keep going here. So now he's telling you a story that's important that relates to James being the high priest service. He served as the high priest for the Jewish people who were not even Christians in that era, and what kind of respect he had, and what he's telling here is Paul, prior to his becoming claiming to be part of Christianity, he had thrown James off the top of the temple down to the ground, and he was badly injured and both legs were broken by Paul. Okay. So this was the instigation of an enemy clearly intended to represent Paul in the original, a riot that has as its counterpart the notice in the Antiquities by Josephus after the stoning of James about a riot in Jerusalem led by one Solace. So again, Josephus is telling us of a story about the attack on James, that James Just, the brother of Jesus. And he's telling us this was led in a riot in Jerusalem by someone named Solace. Now, this is very important. Solace is Saul. We all should know that in the book of Acts, Luke refers to Paul only as Saul originally. And then at a certain point, he just stops using that word. I think it's right around Acts 16. And he starts saying Paul. So if you look at Acts 13, verse 1, it's Solace. Then by Acts 16, he now calls him Paul. So Solace was his name, very well known at the time. And he was he was an infamous figure in the book of Josephus, this person. And he matches exactly what the Clementines are talking about. Okay, that's what he's pointing out. This same Solace would also appear to be the intermediary between the men of power. He's talking about Josephus. The men of power. Who would that be? The Herodians are the men of power. The high priests. We just showed you that the Herodians picked the high priests. The principal of the Pharisees, meaning the leaders of the Pharisees. So this single figure, Solace, has all these connections to the Herodians, to the high priests, and the Pharisees, and all those desirous for peace. Okay, this is how Josephus puts it. So these are quotes from Josephus. So what do we see about Saul, who becomes known as Paul? It appears he's treated royally by the Romans, who capture him and save him actually from the mob in Acts 21, who are trying to seize him and have him arrested and put under Sanhedrin law, and they take him and put him away in a carefully protected place in Caesarea, where he stays for a couple of years, and then eventually he's moved into a comfy private home in Rome while he's waiting the appeal in front of Nero. That's how the book of Acts ends, and most people don't know that. And he has, and then Paul tells you he served the high priest, right? He was sent down on missions to kill Christians. Well, that would be because they're the high priest, the Herodian agents, and the Herodians don't like anybody who claims he's a Messiah, any conflicting power or kingship. They believe they're the kings of Israel, and so they don't acknowledge there should be anybody else. And they want to kill Jesus. They want to kill Christians who are following a Messiah king other than themselves. So you have to see it's a political issue for the Herodians. It's not a spiritual one in that sense. That's why Herod kills all the babies. Herod the Great, the father of the four kings of the time period of Jesus, that original king orders their death because he's threatened politically. He's not thinking there's this spiritual Jesus. He's thinking politically, I don't want anyone to be loyal to anyone but my monarchy. And his four children inherited the same attitude of protecting their kingship over and against somebody who claimed to be the Messiah, and which means anointed one or king, if you don't know. That's in Psalm 2. And then this third trait of this person is he is in league with, according to Josephus, the principal of the Pharisees, meaning the main center of the Pharisees. So do you see the irony of who this could be? The Clementines aren't making this stuff up. Josephus is telling you this same person has connections to the Herodians, the high priests, and Paul clearly says he served the high priests, and clearly acting on the behest of the Herodians, not a spiritual community. And third, he was connected to the principle of the Pharisees. And Paul says in a speech in Acts, he says, I am a Pharisee. So you have these three things all lining up perfectly from Josephus. So you see what Eisenman brings to the table. He doesn't just know this work. He knows all the works of that time period. So he can place and put in at the very right moment. You need to read this and share with people, say, hey, look, there's an event that is unquestionably true that Josephus wrote that happens to be also covered in the Clementine homilies about Solace. And this is his pre-Christian life when he throws James off the edge of the precipice up high at the temple. He throws him down. He breaks his legs, and that's the pre-Christian Paul, the Paul who isn't yet claimed to have met Christ on the road to Damascus, in a visionary return from heaven down to earth just to see him and a few other guys with him. And let's continue here. And this Solace has a connection to one other person, and Agrippa, whom Josephus also calls Solace, kinsman. Do you see that? Then it goes on to not just say Agrippa is someone he's connected to. Then Josephus says Solace is a kinsman, a relative of Agrippa, Herod the Agrippa. Do you see this now, my friends? Paul's getting all this special treatment because his relative is Herod Antipas. And who's Herod Antipas? The person who sent Jesus back to Pilate to have him be killed and executed. That's who he is. And that's why they got rid of him. And that raises the serious question, which we're starting to investigate. Is Paul an Herodian? And was he brought into our movement to destroy us and not help us? Because truly, friends, how could anybody in their right mind have said what Paul says in Galatians, that the law was given by angels through a mediator and these angels are weak and beggarly celestial beings. That's in Galatians 3:19, read with Galatians 4:9. And if you think I'm wrong, go take a look at studylight.org and research on Google. Google studylight.org, Vincent chapter 4 commentary on Galatians. You'll see he connects all these dots. Okay, so I hope that helps. Now here's a footnote where if you want to find where in the antiquities you can find all that, you will. So I screen captured that and put it here. Footnote 11 is at page 107, and it says Solace As to Solace, see Josephus, Antiquities 20.9.4, and Josephus, War of the Jews 2.17.3. Okay, so I'll look into that in another episode so we can make more confirmation of what and test what Eisenman says. But I've read that independently myself long ago, so I'm confident he's correct. Okay, so that's going to end this episode at this point. This is 26 minutes approximately. And what we're going to do is we're going to actually switch to episode 18 of Famous Quotes About Paul, and it's going to be the quotes of Josephus directly about Paul of our New Testament when he was first known as Solace, which you see in the book of Acts. That's how he's first presented. And then in the middle of Acts, after chapter 13, I think it's around chapter 16 of Acts, it's changed to Paulus. So we're going to look at that, and you'll be very surprised, I think. This is something that Eisenman is citing, so we're going to actually make this also simultaneously episode or part 4 of the episode 17 of Eisenman's quotes about Paul, but this will be specifically just about Josephus. Just a quick peek. We're going to show you the quote of antiquity, the Jewish Antiquities 20, chapter 20. We're going to go to look at the War of the Jews, or the Jewish War, book 2, and we'll show you just a quick link at them. Here you'll see the words here, and then later we'll get into these words from the War of the Jews. Okay, so don't miss it. It's going to be a big blockbuster, I believe. God bless. Take care. Ciao. Bye.